If you are watching this video, there's a good chance you at least know what Juke's Towers of Hell is, if you haven't already played it. In the off case you don't, Juke's Towers of Hell, or JToH for short, is an experience on Roblox where you climb towers of varying difficulty. Each tower has a difficulty, which are all on the difficulty chart. This is to help you find out roughly how hard each tower is. There are 11 different difficulties in JToH, spanning from a challenge to someone who has never played Roblox, all the way to, well, this. This difficulty is called Catastrophic, being the final difficulty in JToH. Believe it or not though, there are actually 2 more difficulties above this that are currently possible. These difficulties are Horrific and Unreal, with Unreal being the hardest difficulty ever completed, with a total of 4 towers ever beaten. These 2 difficulties are only in the Pit of Misery inside of JToH. However, the community has brought it upon themselves to make towers of this difficulty, with some of these towers making it into various fan games, or the tower has just been found as an experience on Roblox. People of the JToH community decided to make a list of all the hardest towers, either in JToH, their own places, or in fan games. For an idea of just how hard Horrific and Unreal towers get, this is the Tower of Cruel Punishment, known for its difficulty and incredibly lengthy and punishing gameplay. This tower sits at the very peak of Catastrophic, meaning it is the hardest thing you can do before the Horrific difficulty. As of me writing this, there are currently 26 towers that have been completed harder than this. I myself had a question that I am sure others also wondered. Why is there nothing above Catastrophic in JToH? Well, as I said, there technically is, as the Pit of Misery has Horrific and Unreal towers. However, this area isn't canon, meaning that the towers do not give badges, and they don't give a tower point like the rest of the towers. So a better question would be, why is Horrific not canon? I can't really find much info on this, but if I had to guess, it was because when Catastrophic was added, it was seen as impossible. The first kata in the game was Tower of Elongated Runs, which remains as the second hardest canon tower in JToH. After this came Tower of Generation Failure, which is a lot easier in comparison, being the second easiest kata. The Tower of Generation Failure was first completed on October 18th, 2020, which is just over 4 months since Ring 8's release. Ring 9 released after this on April 22nd, 2021. Tower of Elongated Runs was still unbeaten at this point, and 3 more katas were now added into the game, being Tower of Augmented Misery, Tower of Champions Road, and Tower of Cruel Punishment, which still remains the hardest canon tower today. This area then ended off the rings, meaning that World 1 only had the Upper Palace area to release, which only has an intense obelisk. This means that the ability to add Horrifics to the game will not be possible in World 1 unless some major changes were made to add later rings, which I highly doubt will happen. So, the reason Horrifics are not canon is most likely due to the fact that they were seen as impossible by the time the last ring released. However, we've seen the release of Zone 8, and soon the release of Zone 9. Both of these zones host a Catastrophic tower, which means we once again can see the potential of a Horrific tower being added with Zone 10. Zone 10 is supposed to be a soul-crushing zone, similarly to Ring 9, meaning that a majority of the towers are going to be insane and above. So, let's talk about the possibility of a Horrific being added. Well, at this point, there have been no signs of a Horrific being added to the difficulty chart. Except for the fact there actually is. Heading into Zone 8, we can see the difficulty chart is one of the first things you see in the lobby, similarly to most areas in JToH. Unlike most areas, if we look at the top of the difficulty chart, we can see a barely visible object on top of the Catastrophic difficulty. Using the prism from the Ring 4 ticket shop, you are able to see that the color of this object is a shade of purple. However, this shade does not match the colors of Horrific or Unreal's colors. According to the JToH wiki, this color has been put at the top of every difficulty chart in World 2 since Zone 6, but it now only appears in Zone 8. The thing is, the different color actually makes me think the Horrific difficulty is more likely to get into Zone 10. According to the JToH wiki, Gameter, the co-owner of JToH, said that if towers above the Catastrophic difficulty become more doable by the community, and not just the top players, then there is a possibility of a difficulty above Kata under a different name and different shade of purple, like the one at the top of the difficulty chart, being added to Zone 10. Gamma said, quote, "Just don't worry about the nightmarish difficulty right now since you won't see one until Zone 10 at the least." End quote. You can find this in JToH discussion said by Gamma's old account. The question then becomes how much of the community could realistically do a Horrific. Well, Gameter stated that on May 12, 2021, which at the time TOGF was the hardest tower completed, as TOER was not verified until a few months later. Now, the hardest tower completed is Citadel of Infinite Void, being low Unreal. There are currently 8 victors of COIV. Now, as I mentioned before, 26 towers are harder than TOCP. Not just that, but TOCP and TOVH have now been done both on mobile. But how many people can beat Horrific towers? Well, since none of the Horrific towers in JToH give a badge, and not everyone records their completion, we'll use the badge count for TOCP. Last time I checked, there have been 389 people who have obtained the badge for TOCP. However, we can't just say that 389 people have the potential to beat a Horrific tower, as some of them are exploiters. And sadly, the number of exploiters is unknown, so I'll take 20% of that number off as a rough estimate. This still leaves 311 people who could beat a Horrific tower if they wanted to. And since Gamma had said that it would be Zone 10 at the latest while TOGF was the hardest tower, I think it is highly likely a Horrific tower may appear in Zone 10. The reason being is that some people really enjoy pushing their skill in JToH, and that is kind of what the game is all about. Some people stop at TOCP as JToH doesn't offer any more cannon towers to push your skill. However, that would change if Zone 10 did add a Horrific tower into it. Not only that, but another reason why people may not want to push their skill above Kata is because towers are slim to pick from. And some people may not find them fun, as some have lower quality gameplay. If a Horrific was added into Zone 10 though, this could lead more builders that build for JToH into making more Horrifics, as maybe future areas could host some as well, especially once World 3 comes around. This is just my opinion though, so I decided to ask some others about what they think of a Horrific tower being added into Zone 10. I asked 5 people who have beaten at least a high Kata tower about their thoughts on a Horrific getting added into Zone 10. First up, we have a friend of mine, Vince. Unfortunately, Vince wasn't able to VC, so I will read off the questions I asked him and give the answers he gave. The first question was just a bit about himself and his hardest tower. His response: "I'm Vince, and my hardest tower is Tower of Vacant Hindrances. I've been playing obbies for a few years, but I mainly started playing JToH in November 2023. Before I played JToH, I played top maps in FE2 CM and speedran FE2. I beat TOVH in July 2024. The next question I asked him was if he thinks a Horrific tower will be added into Zone 10. His response: "Personally, I don't think a Horrific tower will ever be added to a canon area. I think the devs want to keep the peak in main JToH at TOCP. Then I asked him, would you want a Horrific tower in Zone 10? His response: "I think it was cool if a Horrific tower got added into Zone 10, since it would most likely be a starter Horrific if one did get added. So you could have the satisfaction of having a win message in main JToH, but I wouldn't say I'd really want a Horrific there." Lastly, I asked him if he thought it was a good idea for JToH to add a Horrific tower into Zone 10. His response: "I don't think it would be good for JToH since I think people that try to 100% the game would not like it, and there isn't really any reason to add a Horrific to Zone 10. There's plenty of other games where you can play Horrifics, So I think they add a horrific to Zone 10, people will mostly complain about it. Next is someone you may have heard of, Kyle G250X. Thanks for being here, Kyle.
Glad to be here.
So why don't you give me a bit about yourself, maybe give off your hardest tower?
So, as you've said, my name is Kyle. I've been working on JToH since 2019. My hardest tower is TUCP or TUVH, depending on which you see harder. But I have been working on Jabberwock Jagger, and my PB is floor 7. So, hope you're interested in that.
Ooh, that's kind of gaming. So, do you think our horrific tower will be added into Zone 10 at some point?
I would like to believe so, but if they don't, I'm okay with that whatsoever because, I mean, a lot of the playing community is still at its like intense or remorseless skill level. Not many people do SCs, so I completely understand like that perspective of the community, but I think it would be cool just to get people to strive for like doing something harder than catastrophics, you know?
Yeah. Now, do you personally want a horrific in Zone 10?
I never really thought too much about this question, but I think, me personally, I would love to see Horrific in Zone 10, just because, like, again, that's another official JToH thing. If there's a Horrific, people will want to go for it for that 100%, and also push them to conquer new goals and all that stuff.
Yeah. And I guess you kind of answered this, but do you think adding a horrific into Zone 10 would be good for JToH as a game?
Yeah, 100%. Just, as I've said, it would push the players to do more, and overall just get them more interested in Harder Towers.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, man.
You're welcome.
Then I asked the same questions to CVero. Hello, CV. Thanks for taking some time to be here.
Yep.
So I just got a couple questions for you about horrifics being added into Zone 10. But before we get to that, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, like what your hardest tower is?
My name is Sivro. I first played JToH in 2018, and around 2 years ago I started grinding the game a lot, and which is when I started getting good. And my hardest tower is CYV.
Nice. That's a little hard. So,
Yeah.
all right. So the first question here is: do you think a horrific will be added into Zone 10?
Honestly, that's a good question. I don't really know. I feel like they probably will. It just depends on the feedback of the community, I guess. Because I think the community wants it, but they just aren't giving it for some reason.
All right. And what about your opinion on that? Would you want a horrific in Zone 10?
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, even I would even advocate for an Unreal just because if you go back like to Ring 9 with TOCP, that was a really big moment in the community where the hardest thing ever was beaten. So if that was another thing to happen in JToH, where it was like a canon Unreal and it was the new hardest thing, harder than COIV, that'd be really cool in my opinion. And also, it would push the skill ceiling too.
I get you, but I don't know about that one happening.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
would be cool though. I get
Yeah.
the idea behind it.
Yeah, like I'm certainly open to like I feel like many like I feel like a tower of any difficulty that's possible should be in the game.
Awesome. Razor just interrupted that interview, but it's fine.
Oh,
I'll stick with it. So do you think a horrific would be good for JToH as a game?
yeah, for sure. Just because in general in JToH there's two types of people. There's the people who want to beat everything, and then also people who just want to push themselves. And this kind of contradicts what I said, but if it was just a horrific tower, it would certainly still be good for the people who are completionists just because TOCP isn't that much easier than, for example, like a Go Horrific Tower. So they would be able to do it, and then also people who want to push themselves to like their limits. Horrific is a really good difficulty to do that, so I think it would be very good.
Yeah, I kind of have the same view on that, honestly, or at least somewhat similar.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your interview.
Yep. Thank you.
And finally, I asked someone with one of the most infamous fails ever, Green Bean. Alright, thank you for joining me, Green Bean. So I just have a couple questions here for you. So before we begin, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself and your hardest tower?
Alright, so I'm Green Bean, the first mobile Cata Victor, as most people know me for some reason. And my hardest tower CIV, which took 9 months, sadly. And, having the worst fail in J2 alongside that. And then many, many other fails to beat it. Because, that's awesome. That's COIV.
At least it was done.
At least it was done.
So I just have a couple questions about if horrifics will be added to Zone 10 and what you think.
Uh-huh.
So the first one being, do you think a horrific will be added to Zone 10?
Well, I'm not so sure that a horrific tower will be added into Zone 10. Just because, JToH devs. And I just don't see them doing it. But I think it'd be good if they did. I'm just leaning towards the more the no side of it because I just don't see the devs adding a horrific tower into Zone 10.
Alright, and would you want a horrific tower in Zone 10 if it was up to you?
Yeah, just like in my answer in the last question, I would. In more specific answer, just because I think a canon horrific tower, it just sounds cool. It's different. It's not a kata. The first canon kata tower was literally Tower in 2020, and that was like almost 5 years ago now, since that was the start of 2020. And Zone 10 is also the last non-sub realm area to be released. So, it'd be cool to have a horrific tower in it, something that pushes the difficulty of the game that's canon.
Yeah, and it'd be really cool to see Cruel Punishment no longer be the hardest after over 4 years, too.
Yeah, bro. Tower's been there for too long.
Alright, and one more question for you. Do you think it would be good for JToH as, just for the game, to have a horrific in Zone 10?
For the game, yes. And for the players too. I think for the game, because it just adds that sense of, kind of a finale for the game if they don't add a World 3, because they say they're going to add a World 3, but the way they're progressing on the game right now is just so slow, it's not very likely. So it seems like it'd be a good finale for the game, since it's that final difficulty that players need to hit in the canon difficulty. And for players themselves and not just the game, is so they can push their skill to horrific, because all the palm horrifics suck and nobody wants to do them, let's be honest. Like, only the real dedicated people want to do it. And once again, it's the last non-sub realm area. So it'd be cool to have that nice finale with the horrific.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Alright, thank you for your time, man.
Yep, no problem.
That wraps up everything I have to say here. Feel free to comment your own opinions on a horrific tower getting added into Zone 10, and maybe even which horrific tower we currently have that would be most likely to be added in. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time.